Hello, welcome to Nature Source Care. This is Dr. Fonda Goldman. I am a licensed naturopathic physician with a private practice in Connecticut in the United States. And a lot of my practice actually involves the use of Ayurveda, which is the ancient Indian medicine. And included within that framework, within that paradigm, is the concept of people and symptoms and disease that is comprised of too much wind. So I'm going to talk about that today, as well as how to address that and balance that predominantly through diet. Before we get too deep into this, in the beginning, I just want to add a note of caution that the information presented here is intended only for educational purposes and should not be considered medical advice. For individual medical advice, or if symptoms are severe or worsening, you should really seek out a qualified healthcare professional to help you address your individual needs. So I mentioned Ayurveda. So again, what is it? It's another name for just traditional Indian medicine. It's actually a practice that's over 5,000 years old. So it is not only knowledge, but there's a lot of wisdom involved in this tradition. And what I've been very impressed with through my clinical practice, I've been a naturopathic physician for about 14 years. And I use nutrition with almost everybody who comes into the door. It comes in through the door. And the reason why in our philosophy as natural medicine doctors is that we believe that very often, not always, but very often, food is the first medicine because through food, you're giving your body building blocks, and it can affect your health in so many ways. So what I've been impressed with Ayurveda is that through its 5,000-year-old tradition, it has a deep, deep knowledge base of foods and the energetics of foods and how it affects both the body and the mind. So, in many ways, even though I do use Western conventional kind of approaches to nutrition, I find that it's those approaches are really quite limited in comparison to what Ayurveda has to offer regarding specifically nutrition. And one of the other things about Ayurveda is that, because it's 5,000 years old, this sort of predates our more modern notions of chemistry because it seems like a lot of Western models of nutrition is actually more food chemistry. So when you take something like ginger and you break it down in a test tube over heat or other chemicals, you start to sort out the different chemicals within ginger, and then you start to test out which of those chemicals is important for like inflammation or arthritis or pulmonary conditions, things that ginger is typically used for, but there isn't actually a whole lot of double-blind research, peer-reviewed research on whole food because it's simply too complicated. I used to be in a PhD program for immunology, and I'm very familiar with the scientific process. And unfortunately, the scientific model, I think, is very limited in terms of how it can assess the medicinal properties of food. And unfortunately, the other thing about it is that there's not a whole lot of financial backing, in terms of money available to do these sorts of studies. I mean, unless the ginger farmers of the world come together and support studies, there just aren't going to be a lot of studies being done, unlike a lot of larger companies that have more funds to develop, food chemistry based studies, for example, because they can use those chemicals to sort of alter foods and make them unique to their company that only their company sells. So anyway, not to get too deep into the sort of financial aspects of why research exists or doesn't exist, but to get back to this notion of Ayurveda, it actually does get into like, you know, ginger versus cinnamon versus mint, like which of these spices is best for you in the summer versus in the winter. And it has a lot of, again, knowledge and wisdom regarding that. So it's very helpful, in terms of when you're talking to patients about, okay, what do I choose to put on my plate for breakfast, lunch, or dinner? There's just a lot more to work with from the Ayurvedic perspective. What's also nice about Ayurveda is they don't only talk about what to eat, but how to eat and when to eat. So the timing and your whole sort of process or ritual, I would even say, about how you eat is really important with how you absorb nutrition and also deal sort of intake the energies of food. And as you can already imagine, Ayurvedic approaches to health in general, not just nutrition, but, is really much more timeless than trendy. So in modern society, somebody will write a book and everybody gets excited about the book, and then everybody starts following the book for, a couple of years. And then somebody else writes another book, and then everybody sort of swings directions 180 degrees, and they start following a different thing because everybody's looking for sort of this magic bullet. And what's nice about the Ayurveda is that it's timeless. And yeah, so you don't have to sort of swing back and forth and end up confused about what you should eat because somebody sort of published a different opinion about it. Um, yeah, the other thing about Ayurveda I really appreciate in terms of nutrition is that it's a pretty sustainable plan. I don't really get people coming to me saying, I can't do this. um, what I do get people coming to me with sometimes is that when I give them a food list, because it doesn't cut out whole food categories, that's what makes it sustainable. Once in a while, people miss a certain food or two that's not on the list. But even within Ayurveda, they typically suggest that people follow the prescribed diets, about 80% of the time, ideally. So there's that 20%. The 80% is sort of your core diet, and the 20% allows some flexibility in terms of, what you're eating and maybe your circumstances. Maybe you're traveling or in a place or in a time when you can't get, everything on the list. So it's good to be flexible. So that's also a positive point of Ayurveda. And I did mention just briefly the the energetics of food. So if we look at the pictures here, we have a picture of ginger and cinnamon and mint. I don't know if intuitively or instinctively you get an idea of which one's the coolest, and that would be mint, and which one is the hottest, and that would be ginger, and which one is middle of the road, and that would be cinnamon, which is slightly warming but not excessively so. And based on the energetics of food, it can actually warm up the body and the mind. Or if you eat mostly cool foods, it can cool down the body and the mind. And sometimes that amount of heat or amount of coolness can destabilize the body and produce disease. So, what is Vata? That's what we're talking about today, the one concept within Ayurveda that's actually pretty important as a foundational idea, is that within the framework of Ayurveda, they typically see people and symptoms from an elemental point of view. So, people, their constitution, and their transitional symptoms can be seen predominantly as too much wind, or vata, too much fire, or pitta, or too much earth, or kapha. So you can just, you have some sense of what these things are, right? The wind, right, especially when we get into fall or the windy season, the wind is generally cold or cooling, right? It's moving around. It's typically erratic. Because the wind is moving around, it typically dries things out. So the qualities of vata or the wind are light, cold, dry, subtle, right? You can't see the wind, but you can see the effects of the wind. Clear, movable, active, and rough, right? Because things are coming and going, but not necessarily in a rhythmic way. It's pretty intermittent. Fire is a contrasting concept. That's too much heat. So that's, summertime. Um, those symptoms tend to be inflammatory and intense and red, hot. Earthy symptoms tend to be ones where things are building in the process and sometimes actually too stable. So when people have too much sugar in their blood or diabetes or too much cholesterol in their blood or they're creating kidney stones or gallstones, those are all situations in which the body's building things in the body, and sometimes too much to the detriment of somebody. But getting back to this concept of vata, actually any of these three concepts, vata, pitta, or kapha, wind, fire, earth, the way that you balance them is that you give the opposite qualities to what they are. So with wind or vata, right, light, cold, dry, those are symptoms of wind or vata. You want to offer things that are heavier, moister, warmer, to balance those qualities of wind or vata. Now, it's important to note that some people naturally have more Vata than others constitutionally. So, if your constitution involves a lot of wind or Vata, you will always tend towards imbalances in this area. But you can also sort of situationally or temporarily have too much wind or Vata. And that typically happens when there's too much change going on around a person. So, currently, as I'm recording this, we're in the middle of the coronavirus, COVID-19 situation, 2020, and all the quarantining and lockdowns and stuff that have happened, people having to work from home and kids not being able to go to school. It's pretty much turned almost everybody's life upside down. And all that wind has definitely shown up in people. I typically find more people coming in with windy like symptoms, which I'll describe in the next couple slides. Um, Things like insomnia and arthritis and anxiety, they typically start to come in August, September. So around here in Connecticut, that's when summer's transitioning into fall, and we're getting more fall or windy weather. But I've been getting people coming in here since March or April when all the lockdowns and things started happening, because all that change really activated a lot of Vata and wind within people. So again, you can have a constitutional excess of Vata or a temporal or situational excess of Vata. So, again, it's not all bad. What we're trying to do is balance the wind or the Vata so that it's more like a cool summer breeze, which is actually very refreshing and pleasant, to move around in and travel around in, versus when people have, a huge excess of Vata or wind, in which they become mentally and physically sort of like a tornado. And again, I mentioned Vata, again, is not all bad. I don't want to put this in people's minds as good and bad. Every one of these, the wind, Vata, fire, pitta, and earth, kapha, when they're in excess, they can be imbalanced, but they all have their attributes. And so if we think about Vata at its best, or when Vata people are balanced, the qualities that they tend to express, or that they're the most flexible of the three types, because again, they like to move, and moving, their bodies and their minds, they tend to be flexible in both ways. um, when their Vata is too high, they can actually start to dry out and become kind of more rigid. um, as we kind of see with people as they get older. People are moving towards more of a Vata type situation as we get older, right? Skin starts drying out, hair starts drying out, bones start drying out. A lot of things start drying out as we all get older. So we're all sort of moving in that direction. The later years of life after 55 years of age or so are considered the Vata years. But again, getting back to the, kind of peak qualities of Vata, Vata people also tend to be very creative. They're very much idea people. They like to explore ideas. They're great at marketing. They're great artists, musicians, because they're really open and also perceptive. So they're open to ideas and thoughts. They're not stuck or rigid in their exploration of things. But because their minds are light and subtle, as the qualities of wind and Vata go, they're actually very astute at picking up at subtle impressions regarding art and music, right? They're able to sort of like tap into this creative source and download these ideas, because that sort of process requires a pretty subtle perception of um, intuition and inspiration. Vata people also tend to be very innovative because, again, they're so creative and flexible. Um, not even by trying, this is just sort of their nature. They can be sort of pioneers or innovative people. And again, they are idea people. They love ideas. They also usually like to talk, although you get both the extroverted and introverted varieties. So they like to talk about ideas. They like to explore things, explore places. They like that stimulation. And again, because they're idea people and innovative and creative and perceptive, they tend to be agents of change within society, because again, they're just sort of naturally not really locked into, even certain paradigms. They're sort of always, potentially out of bounds of more rigid thought processes or social conventions and stuff like that. So just sort of, again, without really trying, they can be agents of change. They tend to love to travel, sometimes to their detriment, because traveling too much will increase vata and imbalance them. But they love to explore. They don't like to, kind of be in one place. So it's great, right? They get to go to all these cool places and see different ways of being and living in the world. They also tend to be communicators. Um, Sometimes it's because they have a lot of restless energy, and they need to kind of discharge the energy by talking. But again, it's mostly they love to discuss and expand their ideas and um, share them with others. And it become again because these are imaginative folks, with their light, creative, perceptive minds. They tend to be dreamers. They don't have big visions. Sometimes they don't always have the stamina or the focus or the sort of follow through um, to turn their dreams into reality. It can actually help if they are also a combination like wind fire type, because the fire gets them focused and moving, as long as they don't burn themselves out, or if they have some earth or kapha, because it keeps them grounded. But they tend to have big dreams and, again, a very vivid imagination. And I already did mention to some extent the intuitive side. Again, because Vata people tend to have a very light, perceptive, subtle mind, they can sort of catch these, intuitive hunches or energies. They're probably a little more sensitive. They tend to be the most sensitive of the three types. And so they're able to pick up on these sort of subtle vibrations, if you will, of intuition. And along with that is they can kind of even take the intuition a notch higher, and they can be quite psychic. They tend to dream a lot because even at night when they're sleeping, their minds are still open and perceptive to energies both within and without. Um, so yeah, these are Vata people at their best. So Vata in excess, now that's a different story. So this is when people start to usually come in the door of the clinic. So when we see too much wind or Vata, most of the symptoms can be categorized as too much dryness or instability, both in the body and the mind. So symptoms that are typically examples of excess Vata, things like dry skin and hair, eczema, so sort of a dry, patchy, skin condition. Their skin in general tends to be sort of dull and gray rather than like red, like the pitta or fiery types are, or white, like the kapha or earthy types are. They tend towards a lot of gas and bloating. Again, that wind also manifests in the digestive system. They also tend towards constipation because the dryness affects the colon, and so when the colon gets dry, it's hard to pass stool, and so they get constipated. They tend towards fatigue and weakness because they're idea people and they love to explore. They can be quite hyper, but they don't have the sort of stamina or groundedness that the other types have, and so they wear themselves out, and they get out of balance pretty quickly. Restlessness, again, that's sort of like nervous energy that a lot of Vata people have because their nervous systems are quite sensitive. And that restlessness, again, is sort of this internal window is sort of roving around. Arthritis can definitely be a Vata symptom. Although the Vata arthritis tends to be of the type where you have the dry cracking joints or the degenerative type or like the or osteoarthritis because the bones and the joints are just drying up and sort of degenerating. Other Vata symptoms, especially if the nervous system, like cramping, pain that comes and goes or wanders around, sciatica, those are typically Vata in excess symptoms. Osteoporosis already, again, drying, not just drying the skin and the hair, but drying out of the bones and lightening of the bones. That's a Vata symptom. For women, when they have a light, irregular, sometimes absent period, that can be a sign of Vata, that they're too sort of light in their constitution and what they're eating. And so there's just not enough sort of fuel and groundedness to support a regular period. Infertility also, that can be a sign of just too much dryness in the sexual system for both men and women. And Vata, it concentrates a lot in the nervous system and the mind. So a lack of focus and concentration, and this can be sort of chronic, like kids with ADD or ADHD, or it can be even later, when we all get older. Have to make sure our brains are still functioning well. But when people start losing focus and concentration, or even having like memory problems, that sort of thing, when their mind is becoming too light, um, it can start to lose sort of its internal sort of structure of focus. So those can be signs of too much vata. Fear, anxiety, emotionally, those tend to be the emotions associated with vata. Also, loneliness, that sort of they can feel isolated, and yeah, that again, those are the symptoms. So when people show up with a lot of fear, anxiety, loneliness, typically they're in a excess vata state. And also insomnia. Their minds are so light that they can't kind of release and relax into that, deep sleep, in the middle of the night. So what increases vata? I mean, what gets people to the point of having symptoms like this? Well, actually, a lot of people, it's the food that they eat, and so that's what we're going to talk about today. But other things, so weather I mentioned briefly, so people tend to be the windiest or show up with windy symptoms more when there's windy weather. So for us, it's fall in Connecticut. Fall tends to, the transition from from summer to fall tends to happen actually at the end of July, beginning of August. Although people tend to focus more on the temperature outside. And so they might say, oh, it's warm, in August and September. And they kind of are not paying attention to subtle signs of the change. So I typically watch the Canada geese. They tend to migrate, and the last few years have been migrating starting the last 2 weeks of July. So they're, I think, much more in tune with changes in the weather and subtle energies like that. Also, there's certain trees, like the birch tree is usually one of the first ones around here that might drop a few leaves. And again, it may not catch your eye because it's only a couple leaves, but they do start to drop, early in August. But again, if you're just focused on the temperature and you're outside enjoying yourself at the beach, you may not be paying attention to these things, but they are happening. So weather affects Vata, food does, activity, so really intense, erratic activities, again, because Vata is always moving and shaking as much as they can before they collapse. Too much activity can unground Vata and make them worse. Any sort of change, so I mentioned COVID, we're going through all that right now as a global event. That's really increased Vata and again, fear, anxiety, loneliness in a lot of people just because of the global circumstances, traveling. Anytime there's change, even like the change of weather from like summer, not just summer to fall, but even like winter to spring, anytime there's change there's usually about a 3 week period during the seasonal changes when people will get more Vata-like and they'll start to feel overwhelmed or get like a little uneasy or just feel like, whoa, I'm like, I need to just like chill out and like kind of stay at home or something because like they feel, this ungroundedness. Any sort of activity that's inconsistent. So again, the wind comes and goes. It's not consistent. So anytime you don't have a consistent schedule, like a consistent eating schedule or wake up and fall asleep schedule or like a weekly schedule, like days that you go to work, whenever you don't have structure in your life, that can increase vata. Yeah, and that includes, again, that's all ways of not being grounded. So again, the way to decrease vata and to balance out these symptoms, diminish these symptoms, is to increase the opposite qualities to balance out the vata. So before we start to talk about whole food, let's talk about taste and how they affect vata, because taste to some degree actually create the whole food. So taste can also be broken down into elemental components. So let's just look on the left here. We have sour, salty, and sweet. So from the Ayurvedic perspective, if we um, turn these tastes into their elemental components, sour taste is made from earth and fire, salty taste is made from water and fire, and the sweet taste is made from earth and water. So earth, fire, and water, these components of these three tastes, sour, salty, and sweet, they actually balance Vata or wind because none of these elements is actually wind or ether space. So if we look at the right side here, if we look at pungent, astringent, and bitter, pungent or spicy taste is made from air and fire. Astringent taste is made from earth and air, and bitter taste is made from air and ether. So you can see these three tastes have at least one of their components as air. And because Vata is, essentially the wind, and the wind is basically a lot of air blowing around, the taste of pungent, astringent, and bitter actually increase Vata. So to balance out the Vata again, the flavors you want to increase in your diet, generally speaking, are sour, salty, and sweet. They will balance Vata. And the ones that will increase Vata and make you more imbalanced are pungent or spicy, astringent, and bitter. So we're going to start going through different food categories in terms of which foods in each category are best for Vata or actually imbalance Vata, or the wind element. So with fruit, most fruits are actually okay for Vata. There are some exceptions. And essentially what you want to do is avoid dry fruit. So any kind of dried fruit, dried blueberries, dried bananas, dried mango, dried figs, raisins, again, anything that's dry is going to increase the wind or Vata element because the wind is dry or drying. So you want to avoid dry foods in general. Cranberries is another one. Most cranberries, they're very, very sour and astringent, and so they will increase Vata element. Usually, because cranberries are so sour and astringent, you usually need a lot of sugar to get them down, and it's just too much for most people. Pears also, it's sort of a funny one, but when you eat a pear, it actually kind of makes your mouth feel a little bit dry after you eat one. So pears are not the best idea for high Vata people. Persimmons, that's another astringent fruit that, again, when you bite into it, especially if you don't have a really sweet one, it kind of makes your mouth, it almost feel like you have like a chalk in your mouth or something like that. It has this dry taste. That's not particularly good for Vata people. And pomegranates, a very astringent fruit, great for cooling down pitta, fire people, but it's too astringent for Vata types. So besides the general category of dried fruit, which Vata people should avoid, raw fruit, too much raw fruit any time of year, but especially in cold weather is not a good idea because you're eating cold food in the cold weather and Vata is cold by nature. So the fruits you do want to increase are especially the juicy, sweet ones. So apples, apricots, banana, berries, cherries, coconut. Fresh dates, fresh figs, not dried ones, grapefruit, grapes, soaked dry fruit. So you can take that dry fruit if you have it and soak it in water overnight and make it a better option for Vata. Strawberries, kiwi, lemons, limes, mangoes. See, there's a pretty long list here. Melons, oranges, papaya, peaches, pineapple, plums, rhubarb, tamarind. I'd probably be a little bit careful with the rhubarb and tamarind because there is um, the sour taste, but they're a little bit astringent, but not so much as the other ones. They're on the avoid list. Vegetables. Well, vegetables you have to be more careful with because a lot of vegetables, most vegetables actually, because they're light and dry, will increase Vata. So there's a pretty big disparity here. And the other thing is that some of the vegetables that increase Vata, if you cook them, they're actually better for Vata. And cooked food in general is better for Vata because the food is now warm. It has you've added the fire element by cooking it. The other thing is vegetables that are peeled. I know a lot of people here are trying to increase their fiber content, and so they don't peel fruits and vegetables. But the peel on fruits and vegetables is actually rough in texture. And because wind or vata is rough as a quality, as one of its qualities, you would be better to eat food that's fruits and vegetables that are smooth by peeling them. So let's look at the avoid list first. So again, you're mostly avoiding raw and dry food, vegetables. The vegetables on this list: so artichoke, bitter melon, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, burdock root, raw cabbage, raw cauliflower, celery, corn, eggplant, horseradish. Um, these again, like, these are the kind of the lightest, driest, kind of bitter foods. Horseradish is on this list because it's, really pungent, um, and fiery, and so that's gonna, increase Vata, because anytime Vata is exposed to something extreme, like extreme hot or extreme cold, it's going to increase. Also on this list, greens, so all your salad greens, spinach, kale, beet greens, that sort of all of that. Again, the greens are astringent and bitter, so air, as well as ether. Mushrooms, green olives. Green olives are more vata invoking than black olives. Raw onions, again, because they're pungent, and the pungent flavor has air as one of its components, elemental components. Raw peas, not a good idea. Peppers, either sweet or hot, especially hot though, because again, hot stuff, just like horseradish and raw onions, is too fiery and has air as its one of its elemental components and can increase that. Potatoes, especially white potatoes, not a great idea. Prickly pear, radish, kohlrabi. Again, the radish and kohlrabi, they're slightly pungent, so not a good idea, as we talked about from the taste slide. But also they're light and dry and astringent. So what you want to do instead is you want to focus on vegetables that are more moderate and grounding, and such as asparagus, beets, cabbage. Again, there's a asterisk here because raw cabbage is not a good idea, but cooked cabbage you can do some of. Carrots, cauliflower cooked, cucumber, daikon radish, fennel, garlic, green beans, and leeks. Garlic and leeks are a little bit more mild than raw onions. And these two, there's a fine line. So even the garlic and leeks you might want to cook. Lettuce, it's pretty mild. It's a green, but it's not as astringent as, beet greens or dandelion or something like that. Okra, it has the mucilage in it, so it's actually lubricating. Black olives better than green olives. Cooked onions better than raw. Parsnip is a possibility. Cooked peas and sweet potatoes. So when you're in a high vata state, you want to favor the foods on the right side and mostly leave the stuff on the left side alone. As far as grains, many grains are very good for vata because grains tend to be grounding. The thing though is some grains are very light and dry and cooling. So you definitely don't want to eat sort of like um, the fruits and the vegetables. You're better off cooking your cereals and your grains, and having like warm oatmeal instead of dry processed cereal, which is cold and light and dry. But let's just go through this list here. So the things to avoid: barley, again, it's a pretty dry grain. Yeasted bread is not a great idea. Buckwheat, dry cereals, corn. Corn is actually drying and um, um, actually heating as well, but mostly drying. Like that's why, like cornbread, you have to add quite a bit of like oil or eggs or both, to get the cornbread from not, having some moisture in it. Just because the corn itself just generally, that's not its nature. Couscous, crackers. So we're getting into, granola, these sort of processed grains. Um, crackers, cold dry food. Granola, cold dry food. Um, Millet is actually a heating and dry grain. It's not very moisture producing in the body. Muesli, again, a cold dry cereal bran. Again, some people who have constipation are trying to increase their fiber by taking a lot of bran in their diet. That's really not a good idea for Vata people. Oats, dry oats, like putting dry oats on cookies and things like that, or Meatloaf, I guess some people do that. Not a good idea. Pasta, again, super dry. Even when you boil it, you might notice with pasta, for example, or like you can take corn. Like maybe you eat some of these things and you've been eating them forever, and you're like, really? Pasta does all this, or corn does all this? So if you want to do an experiment, if you eat like corn every day or pasta every day for let's say 3, 4, 7, even up to 7 days, you'll probably get constipated. Because again, the nature of these foods is that they're dry and they're drying. So they will suck all the moisture, whatever moisture you have as a Vata person. Usually you're pretty dry to begin with, and then these cereals and grains will suck even more moisture out of you, leaving you in a bad state. Um, yeah, so these things not the best to indulge in most of the time. Definitely not on a frequent or regular basis. Polenta, again, made from corn. Rice cakes, well, those are certainly light and dry, not a good idea. Rye of, it's used in different things, a lot of bread, um, but it's a light and dry grain, so it will make you more vata if you eat too much rye bread. Sago, spelt, those are some alternative grains I don't hear too much about, but those are also drying. And tapioca. Tapioca is very, very drying. Again, if you want to do the experiment, I wouldn't suggest it, but if you want to do the experiment, if you eat a lot of tapioca, let's say you make a big batch of tapioca pudding and you eat tapioca every day, if you are a Vata person, you will become more dry and you will see pretty quickly your skin drying out and constipation will happen and whatever Vata like symptoms you had before will start to get worse. On the side, on the list of things to favor, so again, we're looking at moist and warming grains. Amaranth is a good idea. Durum flour is a possibility. Cooked oats, like oatmeal in the morning, is okay. Pancakes, quinoa and rice, seitan, sprouted wheat and wheat. So again, these things are more nourishing. They're going to actually moisturize the body and decrease the dryness that comes along with a lot of vata. So legumes, most actually legumes, so beans and lentils for the most part are actually not a great idea for Vata people or people with high Vata, high wind, because beans are light and dry and they're difficult to digest. And we know, right? That's what beans and lentils are sort of known for. They're known for causing gas, which is obviously a windy type symptom. So most legumes and beans you should avoid. So aduki beans, black-eyed peas, chickpeas, kidney beans, lentils, like brown ones, lima beans, navy beans, dried peas, pinto beans, soybeans. This is a long list. Almost every bean and lentils on this list. And the legumes to favor, and again, even the ones on the favorable list, I really recommend that Vata people only consume them like maximum twice a week. Excuse me. Because again, they are so light and dry and they are so Vata provoking. But red lentils, they're a little more balanced. Mung beans, split mung beans look like lentils. I find mung beans and split mung beans at Indian grocery store in my neighborhood. So you might not find them in sort of a conventional grocery store, but um, Asian-based grocery stores will often have these, so you can look for them there. Soy cheese, a little bit. You can do soy milk, soy sausage, sausage are on this list. The thing that you have to know too is that soy decreases thyroid function. So if you have a thyroid issue, any kind of soy is not a good idea. But again, if we're just looking for the few legumes that won't completely tip vata into more vata excess, these are things you can enjoy on occasion. Tofu is actually more balanced and won't throw people with high vata into higher states of vata. Tur dal and urad dal. Most people don't know what these are. These are actually other legumes that are found typically in Indian um, cuisine, and you can find them at Indian grocery stores or ethnic food grocery stores. Dairy. Okay, so whereas legumes were not the great idea for Vata, actually dairy for the most part is really great for Vata because it's grounding, it's soft, it's especially all the calcium and magnesium. Those are really great nutrients for the muscles and the bones and the nerves. So deep in the sort of skeletal system of Vata people who are, again, usually overdoing things without realizing it because they're so sensitive. So there are a few to avoid in the dairy category, and the ones to avoid are mostly in the the drier sides of dairy. So powdered milk. So a powdered milk, it's dry obviously, but also usually for dry milk they have to take out the fat, otherwise it's not shelf stable. Frozen yogurt. Well, most frozen yogurt is fat free, so they've taken out the fat, and then they've taken the non-fat yogurt and frozen it, so you have an extremely cold and dry food. Not good for people who are experiencing too much vata or cold and dry symptoms. And then yogurt with fruit. The reason why this is on the list, yogurt is a possibility for lots of people, but this combination of yogurt with fruit is not a good idea because when you take fruit, all the enzymes and sugar in the fruit combine with the yogurt um, and starts to ferment the yogurt, and that causes a fermentation reaction that's similar to actually the way you make cheese. So when you put fruit with yogurt and you have that in your stomach, it'll start to ferment and will create acid and gas as byproducts of that fermentation reaction. So for somebody who tends towards gas and bloating, um, putting food combinations together in their body that often create gas and bloating is not a good idea. On the list of favorable dairy, though, almost everything else, butter, buttermilk, cheese, cow's milk, goat's milk, ghee, sour cream yogurt, as long as you don't have, again, a food allergy or a known food incompatibility, most dairy is actually very nourishing and grounding for Vata. So as far as meats, actually Vata, this constitution needs meat and protein the most because again, the meat and the protein is something that really grounds the body. So in the meat category though, or protein category, the meats that you want to avoid are the meats that are lighter and drier. So you're seeing a theme here, pattern here. So what are the meats that are light and dry? Um, Rabbit is light and dry, venison and the white part of turkey. Those are all drying. The reason why lamb and pork are on this list, they're actually heavy and fattier um, meats, but they're actually so heavy and so dense. And Vata people tend to have a very light appetite and they have kind of light digestive power, if you will. They have a harder time just having the wherewithal in their bodies to digest heavy foods. These foods are so heavy, it just causes, all sorts of indigestion typically in Vata people. So Vata people want to eat grounding, kind of heavier food, but they also want to balance that a bit with the idea or notion that these foods should be pretty easy to digest. Otherwise, again, Vata people just don't have kind of the in their digestive system to break down all those really complex foods. So on the favorable list here, we've got beef, we've got buffalo, chicken, duck, eggs, fish, seafood, shrimp, and the dark part of turkey. So you can see that like the dark part of turkey and even the dark part of chicken, the reason why these foods are important is that the dark part of these animals tends to have more fat and they tend to be moister than the white part. So, there's always sort of competition during Thanksgiving. You don't want, in the United States, it's sort of traditional to make turkey for a meal. And, it's always a big thing. It's like you want to, cook turkey for a bunch of your friends and family, but you got to make sure it doesn't dry out because it's really easy for that white meat in the turkey to dry out. So rather than even deal with that, go for the dark meat because it's naturally moisture and that moisture will help balance the dryness of vata. So in general, meat is great for Vata. You just have to be a little bit careful about your choices, nothing too dry or nothing too heavy that you can't digest. So nuts and seeds. Most nuts and seeds are really great for Vata because most nuts and seeds have a lot of oil in them and protein. So protein is helpful for building up the body. Vata people, their physical constitution tends to be very light. They tend to be very lean. They have a harder time gaining weight. They have a harder time putting on muscle mass. So the protein is very helpful for them. It also helps to ground them, just give them more mass so that their bodies also are not like, feel like they're floating in the wind. And then the oils, again, the oils are very helpful because of the dryness of Vata. So again, if you look at the favorable list here, we've got, a long list: almonds, Brazil nuts, cashews, cherry nuts, coconut, hazelnuts, macadamia, peanuts, pumpkin seeds, sesame seeds, sunflower seeds, tahini, pecans, pine nuts, pistachios, walnuts. So a lot of people can have a lot of fun in this category. There are ones to, avoid. So popcorn, again, that's a corn derivative. Corn we talked about already a few times, very drying. And especially when you pop it, it's a light, airy food. Not a great idea for Vata people. Psyllium, again, Vata people tend towards constipation. I often see them coming in and they're taking 2, 3 fiber supplements. Usually some of them contain psyllium. Psyllium is a very dry fiber. And so actually when Vata people take psyllium, especially if they're not upping their liquid intake, the psyllium actually does the opposite and kind of creates concrete in their colons. Very uncomfortable for people, and it kind of does the opposite of what they're intending it to do. So psyllium, not a good idea. Chia seeds and flax seeds, not a great idea. These are light and dry seeds, especially in their whole form is not a good idea because they're rough and dry, and most people shouldn't be, anybody really shouldn't, I don't recommend whole chia and whole flax seeds to anybody because they're too irritating for the digestive system. But especially for Vata, they already have a sensitive constitution and digestion. They don't need things irritating their GI, their gut. And the chia seeds and flax seeds, if you do too much of that, they're sort of known, like if you just all of a sudden one day start taking a tablespoon or two of flaxseed, ground flaxseed, and you put it in your cereal because you're trying to up your omega fat status or you're trying to increase fiber. Generally, a lot of people will get gas and bloating from just a tablespoon or two of the ground flax. So the popcorn, psyllium, chia, and the flax, those are the ones to avoid. Otherwise, you can enjoy quite a bit in this category, nuts and seeds for Vata people. Oils and Vata. Okay, so this is another great category for Vata. Vata does extremely well with oils. The best of the three types, oils will tend to make fiery people more fiery because it's like putting gasoline on a fire. And kapha people or earthy people, they're already they already have a heavy constitution, and most oils and fats are heavy in nature, so it doesn't help them a lot. They have to watch it well. But Vata people, they're the ones who enjoy the most oil and fat and do the best with it. It helps replenish their dry skin. It also helps replenish their dry nervous system. So the ones to favor sunflower oil, I'm a big proponent of this. Sunflower oil is good for all constitution types. So it's a very balanced oil, and you can cook with it, bake with it, use it for salad dressing. It takes high heat, so it's got all these heart healthy properties. So that's usually what I suggest as a go-to oil for everybody, but including Vata. Olive oil is really great. It is heavier than sunflower oil, but that's okay. That actually helps to ground Vata. Whole coconut and whole avocado are good. The fats again are helping to lubricate the dry body of a Vata person. Ghee or clarified butter, very helpful. Walnut oil and sesame oil. These two are actually the warming oils on this list, and those are especially helpful in the cold months to help keep Vata, the cold constitution, warm. So the things to avoid though, flax oil, similar to what I mentioned on the last slide, flax oil is very light, almost too light in a way for Vata people. Coconut oil and avocado oil, they're heavy, but they're almost too heavy, where they're not really suggested. Coconut and avocado are not really suggested for anybody um, in its oil form as a whole. Dried coconut flakes or a few slices of avocado. Um, are okay, but coconut oil and avocado oil, from the Ayurvedic perspective, are so heavy that the body and the liver has trouble digesting it, and so it can kind of cause congestion in the liver. So not ideal, especially for a Vata person who already has, you know, somewhat limited fire capacity in the digestive system. Master oil is just way too hot and spicy, and it's also drying because it is heating. So that's just, off too much. It would be considered an extreme oil for Vata. So Vata, enjoy your oils and your fats. Again, if you have other conditions like cardiovascular health problems, you want to steer towards the plant-based oils and fats. Um, but yeah, otherwise you're pretty good in this category, except with a few exceptions. So spices, for the most part, spices are really great for Vata. They give some flavor. They keep quite a few spices are very warming, heating. So Vata people, can do a lot in this category with a few exceptions. And those exceptions are things like cayenne, dry ginger, mustard, and horseradish. These spices, so, like habanero pepper, anything really hot, is not going to be great for Vata because, again, it's too extreme. The extreme heat is going to dry them out and they're already dry. So you can kind of think of it like, if you already have a dry constitution and then you just put in a little bit of, a spark in there, it can really cause a lot of damage. I often give the example of like California. It's so dry, it has all these droughts year after year. For the most part, it's so dry that even if you flick one little match, I mean, you can burn the whole forest down and really just burn the whole thing out because, again, you have such severe dryness, and just even a little spark of heat can, really ruin what's left of the environment. So, we have our own environment. The Vata people, your constitution is dry, so you've got to watch the too much heat. Although because you're cold, you need some, you just don't want to overdo it. Chocolate is on this list, unfortunately, for, to many people, because the caffeine in chocolate, caffeine is not a great idea for Vata people. Caffeine, pushes the mind, pushes the body, makes people hyper and dries them out. So all the things that Vata is actually trying to balance. So chocolate and actually anything with caffeine is not a good idea for Vata people. And that leads us also into the next section here, beverages. So it corresponds with most of the things we've talked about before. So you want to avoid extreme things, really drying things, really heating things. So things you want to avoid: alcohol, not a great idea. Again, Vata people have a sensitive, especially nervous system. So any sort of stimulant, depressant, or whatever, it's usually going to affect them um, faster and harder than other people. Black tea on occasion, but for the most part, you don't want to do too much black tea. One, because of the caffeine, which we talked about, but the other thing is black tea, it's fermented, and so and it also has a lot of tannins. Tannins are used to like literally tan hide, leather for like shoes and purses and belts and stuff. So the tannins are astringent and they dry things out. So if you're drinking black tea every day, between the caffeine and the tannins, it's going to increase your vata. Caffeine, we talked about, not a good idea. It's going to make you hyper. It's going to stimulate your nervous system, which is already overstimulated, and then also dry you out because it's diuretic. Carbonation, again, gas and bubbles in your beverage is not a good idea if you already have, a system that's uh, predisposed to create gas, because it's windy. Chocolate, we talked about. So chocolate in liquid form, chocolate in any form, not the best idea. Coffee, similar to black tea, mostly because of the caffeine, but coffee is also extremely acidic. So acids tend to dry things out, so that's why that's on the list. Iced beverages, not great for anybody because it disrupts the digestive system, but especially for Vata because they're already cold. You don't want to be drinking cold beverages. For the most part, you always want room temperature or higher for your beverages. Juice, um, I would look at the fruits, go back to the fruit slide and see which fruits are okay, and those juices would be okay. You'll see them in the other category here, or the other list here. So, like some sweet fruit juices like apple, blueberry, sweet cherry, and grape, those would be okay. But other ones like pomegranate juice would not. So you want your juices to correspond with the fruits that we talked about. Cold dairy, soy drinks, again, these are going to be way too cold and heavy. Lots of people are going to have a hard time digesting them. Tomato juice, tomato is a very Vata provoking fruit or vegetable. So tomato juice is not a great idea. And anything highly spiced. So if you like to put a lot of spicy, hot, like Tabasco sauce or something in your tomato juice, that's a real bad combination for a Vata person. Instead, you want to favor almond, rice, soy milk. These are much more mild and moderate. Aloe vera, the inner fillet, is actually very balancing, cleansing, and hydrating. So that's a good idea if you're into that. I mentioned some of the sweet fruit juices that are okay. Cider you can do a little bit. It's fermented, but it's a gentle fermentation from apples. Carob, I know it doesn't. It's not the same as chocolate, even though people claim it is. But it would be a much better alternative to chocolate if you're looking for something. Chai is okay as long as it's not too spicy. If it's too hot, it'll throw Vata off. Green coffee would be a better alternative to regular coffee because you don't have as much acid and you don't have the caffeine to deal with. Herbal teas generally better because they don't have caffeine. But even herbal teas, you may actually want to put a little bit of like milk, whether it's cow's milk or almond milk or rice milk, and maybe a little bit of sweetener, especially when you're feeling like you need more grounding as a Vata person, because herbal teas are pretty light and clear. I mean, probably the lightest and clearest, most Vata-like things, ingredients on this whole slide. So by adding some milk, either alternative or cow milk or something, with a little bit of natural sweetener, that'll actually be a little bit more nourishing and substantial for Vata people. Miso on occasion is okay. Veggie juice, as long as it corresponds with the veggies from the previous slides. And actually, bouillon, um, is actually pretty good for Vata people. So you have quite a few options here for Vata people in terms of beverages. There's just a few things you want to consider and avoid to stay balanced. Sweeteners, for the most part, again, the sweet flavor is very grounding and nourishing and hydrating for Vata, so all the things it really needs. The only two that really should be avoided are any kind of artificial sugar. They can actually be, there's some evidence that a lot of them are actually neurotoxic, which, again, as somebody with a Vata symptomology. They typically have a lot of nervous system issues because their nervous system is so sensitive. So any sort of neurotoxin is not a great idea for these people. And white sugar. White sugar, is processed. And they do use bleach sometimes to get it to that nice white color. And again, none of these things are particularly helpful for Vata or anybody really. But other natural sugars, barley malt, fructose, fruit in general, demerara or unprocessed sugar, turbinado, raw sugar, coconut sugar, date sugar, honey, agave, maple syrup, rice syrup, a lot of sugars, natural, as long as they're natural, are actually helpful to Vata to moisturize, ground, and restore, replenish, rejuvenate. So for the most part, we talked about the actual food list, but just as important is talking about the how, which I mentioned in the beginning, Ayurveda is very good with. Um, so the how includes, um, especially for Vata types, eating at regular times and not skipping meals. Vata people typically are all over the place. They're always on the move. Um, and when I ask people, what they had to eat today, a Vata person will typically say, "Oh, I had like a piece of cheese, and then I had some yogurt, and then I had a cup of soup." And you can just tell from even their food list, they haven't even talked about how, but you can tell they're just sort of like grab and go or like just sort of grazing. They don't actually sit down to a meal that's substantial and balanced. They're just sort of picking here and there, kind of doing the minimum to nourish their bodies. And also, they tend to be so busy and overwhelmed because they spread themselves too thin that they don't take a lot of time to plan and cook, food menus and meals and stuff. So those habits, um, get in the way. So not just, the food that they're eating, but the way that they're going about getting their food together, gathering their food and preparing it, is usually not helpful. So I did mention sitting down. So that's actually a good practice if you don't already and have high vata, is you might just want to, even if it's 5 minutes or 10 minutes, because again, vata people, they don't like to sit still. It's kind of not their nature, but they need to to balance their nature. Even if you take 5 minutes and make sure that you don't have, and this goes into the next point, any distractions on, no computer, tablet, phone, TV, um, or, negative conversation. You're really just there sitting mindful of what you're eating, mindful of the whole really blessing that you have this food to take in. Um, that's really important for Vata as a habit. You do want to eat complete meals. I sort of mentioned, a lot of Vata people tend to grab and go, but they just grab like one food and, this piece of fruit, this yogurt, whatever, and they don't actually sit down to a complete meal, which would include a sufficient number of proteins, um, carbohydrate, and fat macromolecules. So, to some degree, sort of like the meat, vegetable, starch, um, making sure that all of those are on a plate with also some healthy fats. That's really important to, again, make sure Vata has enough grounding and support for the body and the mind. And I did mention, a few times through this presentation, Vata people, for the most part, should eat mostly cooked food, and especially in the cold weather. As soon as you're putting on a jacket or a sweater, almost everything you eat should be cold, should be cooked. No salads, no ice cream in winter, not a great idea. So you do want to become more of a soup person than a salad person. Um, so take all those lovely vegetables that you like to eat raw and throw them in a soup pot, and add some spices, and you'll be much better off. So it's just important to note also that you can't control the wind. Try it. It's hard to do, but you can contain it. And the way you contain it is by creating daily habits that support your health and acknowledge, the situational time when there's a lot of change and you have to manage that, or just your own constitution. A lot of times I have to talk to lots of people about just acknowledging and recognizing and supporting, the fact that you have this sensitive constitution. And the more you can do that and stay in balance, the more you can um, receive and share the gifts of having a lot of vata and a lot of wind, your creativity and your intuition, and your innovativeness. I mean, those are all gifts. So, but for somebody who has too high vata, they're not going to be able to share those gifts if they're too out of balance. So something to consider. So thank you so much for your time and learning more about Ayurveda and the concept of vata. I have previous videos that can also be helpful. I have another video that I did on the concept of pitta, or the fire element. So if you potentially have those sorts of symptoms for constitution, that could be very um, helpful, enlightening even for you. Also, I have a video on simple natural techniques that people can use for stress, anxiety, and insomnia. And as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, Vata people are the most likely to experience stress, anxiety, and insomnia because of their light constitutions, especially the light constitution, lightness in their mind and nervous system. And also because Vata people tend to be the driest, you might also be interested in the video I made about choosing what you drink every day, um, especially the first beverage of the day. So I wish you well. I wish you good health, and I'll see you in the next video.